NATO. Love it, hate it, need it. It's been through crises of war, confidence and neglect. It's now needed perhaps most of all. But its members don't want to fork out the cash. So, can NATO finally get its act together? All for one and one for all? Join me, Darasz, for how we got here.
In the spring of 1945, Europe emerged from the devastation of World War II physically shattered and politically uncertain. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced, and the continent faced the urgent challenge of rebuilding not only infrastructure but also stability. Yet, the end of the war did not immediately guarantee peace. A new geopolitical tension was already taking shape between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. As Soviet influence expanded across Eastern Europe, Western European governments grew increasingly anxious about their security. Countries such as Poland, Hungary and Czechoslovakia found themselves within Moscow's political orbit, while Western democracies feared that further expansion might follow. The ideological divide between communist and democratic systems hardened quickly, transforming wartime cooperation into post-war rivalry. In response, the United States and its European partners began to envision a collective security system that would deter aggression and prevent another catastrophic conflict. The result was the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in April 1949. 12 founding members, including the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, and several Western European states, signed a treaty committing themselves to mutual defense. Its core principle, enshrined in Article 5, declared that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. Although NATO was framed as a defensive alliance, its strategic purpose was clear: to counterbalance the power of the Soviet Union. The alliance institutionalized the American military presence in Europe and reassured nations still recovering from war that they would not face external threats alone. In the words of NATO's first ever Secretary General, Lord Hastings Lionel Ismay, the alliance's priorities were to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. More than 7 decades later, NATO remains central to European security. While the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, its successor state, Russia, continues to shape the alliance's policies by being the biggest threat to its existence. The organization, originally built to contain Soviet power, now finds itself once again focused on deterring Russia's expansion. The alliance's origins therefore reflect a defining paradox of post-war Europe. The pursuit of peace required preparation for confrontation. NATO emerged from the ashes of war as both a shield and a signal, an enduring commitment that Europe would not again stand defenseless in the face of expansionist power.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Krzysztof Jaworski. He's the Deputy Director for the Institute for Security and International Development, based here in Warsaw. Welcome once more to the programme.
Thank you for having me.
The quote that we saw in the clip from Lord Ismay, to keep the Americans in, the Russians out and the Germans down, seemed to fail in keeping the Germans down, but it succeeded in keeping the Americans in and the Russians out. Would you say that's a fair assessment of NATO over its first few years, at least?
Yes, I would agree with this assessment, and also if we look at the current state, I think that you pointed right that the Germans are right now much more powerful than they used to be after the last Second World War, especially economically when it comes to their arms capability. This is something which is discussed, and they have many critical gaps when it comes to this readiness of their armed forces. But of course, if we look at this longer period of time, the United States were and currently still are in Europe, and Russia is out of Europe, especially after the collapse of USSR and the disintegration of this empire.
Yes, it's difficult to. When I was a kid, I remember the watchtowers along the East German border, the two huge armies facing off each other on the German plain. Was that the pinnacle of NATO power, would you say, in that it achieved its aim of keeping the Russians out, but at a huge cost financially and in terms of manpower?
Yes, in my opinion, NATO is the most successful alliance in the history because it's established many decades ago. It's currently still the alliance which is providing the security for member states, and also the main rival of NATO, the USSR, collapsed due to this strategic conflict, this strategic rivalry. They couldn't keep the pace towards to the NATO's pace of armament, of development of economics, and collapsed. So yes, I would agree with this.
What's your take on the ups and downs of our relationship with NATO? Some of us say it's a great thing, it keeps the peace. Others, notably President Macron, called it brain dead, and then it was necessary to rejuvenate it after the Soviet reinvasion. Can you trace this love-hate relationship with NATO? Is it part of a certain way of European thinking about security, about anti-Americanism? How did it kind of evolve?
Okay, so it's a very broad topic, so let me try to split it into several points. So the first thing, in my opinion, which we should take into consideration is the situation after the collapse of USSR, and then in decade the first enlargement of NATO, and also the accession of Poland, Czechia and Hungary to NATO. So back then, on the one hand, many, especially in Western Europe, but also in US, pointed that such enlargement is unnecessary because there is no longer the risk of aggression from Russia, and at the same time it would be unwise to provoke Russia.
So it was an alliance that had no enemy against it.
Yes,
looking for an enemy.
At the same time, no reason to exist longer. So in the beginning of 21st century, there started to be the new reason for NATO, and it was the war against terrorism. So many participants of these political processes back then, when they remind this time, they say that it was in the paradox useful that this war on terror started because it gave the reason for NATO to exist and to continue the cooperation, to continue the deepening of the ties between allied countries.
But it was hardly a defensive alliance if it went off to Afghanistan,
yes,
Iraq and other places.
Exactly, and it also impacted the shape of the armed forces because they were expeditionary forces, much smaller, operating on the foreign ground, specialized, focused on several areas, for example, special operation forces, not the general system of deterrence and defense of the territories, mainland territories of allied countries, and especially eastern flank of NATO. The thing that also happened back then in many European countries was this thing we know under the name the peace dividend. Yeah. So they had not any longer to spend so much money on defense, and they took this opportunity and redirected this money into other, of course, also important goals of the states, like, for example, social spending, but at the same time it made the armies less equipped, smaller, and generally less prepared for any possible confrontation.
If we go back to this expansion, NATO expansion point, it started off with 12, now it's got 32. Russia, of course, seems to always to fear NATO expanding into its own, I suppose, sphere of influence, if we can call it that way. Was this a concrete principle that NATO should expand east, or was it the former Eastern Bloc countries, Poland, the Baltics, the other Hungary, Romania, the countries like that? Did they just flee to the west afterwards? how do you gauge the feeling of this enormous movement that welcomed the new players into the alliance?
Yes, there weren't any specific statements written down and signed by both sides regarding the stopping the accession of another countries toward NATO. It would be in the strict opposition with Article 10 of Atlantic Treaty Chart, and also it would be really inconvenient, especially for the Western countries, to sign something discriminatory toward other countries in such explicit way. So there aren't such statements. There were only settlements regarding the level of presence of NATO in countries of current eastern flank, but as far as they were specified in NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, there is a legitimate argument that they are no longer something that should have impact as Russia by waging a war right now, and I mean the hybrid war against the NATO countries, among them, for example, Poland, acts of sabotage, pressure by migrants on our border, and so on. That's, in my opinion, means that it should be considered not to take into account these documents which were formulated back then. And also, Russians are really pointing toward some talks which were conducted behind the closed doors, and they claim that someone on the western side, sometimes they point toward US, sometimes toward Germany, were assuring them that there won't be any enlargement of NATO. But as far as it is interesting from the historical point of view, to some degree it's interesting from a diplomatic point of view, because these are narratives and arguments which are used currently, and diplomats of NATO countries need to engage in discussions where these arguments are used. But at the same time, I think that what is the crucial point here is that these countries which accessed NATO were sovereign countries, and they weren't attacking anyone. They weren't making anything which is against the United Nations Charter, and they were using their right as a sovereign countries to choose the alliances they are part of.
I suppose anyway you see it is going to annoy Russia, whatever happens when its former colonies or former countries join the enemy alliance.
But if I may add, because I think that for many people, especially on the West, from the countries which are members of NATO, which are members of European Union, this is something rather obvious. But at the same time, I think that such narrative used by Russia regarding the aggressive way of enlarging NATO, it is sometimes regarded as a good argument by people outside the Western world. Yeah. And that's why I think it's worth discussing and worth reminding, for example, from the Polish perspective, how this process looked like, because it wasn't like NATO was incorporating Poland into the alliance. It wasn't like Germany wanted this at first. It wasn't like United States wanted it at first. It was the will of Poland, yes. Which is rather rare. It was unifying different political parties back then, and it was many years and many talks of negotiations and of approaches to change the stance of United States, of Germany, and to let them get the Poland into NATO. Yes. So I think it's worth mentioning.
Yes, it's a very great diplomatic achievement that took advantage of a certain set of historical circumstances, I suppose. But we'll explore this further, but for the time being we'll take a look at our next clip.
NATO's expansion since the end of the Cold War reshaped the strategic map of Europe, with no change more symbolic than Poland's entry into the alliance in 1999. For Warsaw, Membership marked the definitive end of post-Soviet uncertainty and anchored the country firmly within Western security architecture. Alongside the Czech Republic and Hungary, Poland's accession represented the first major eastward expansion of NATO, bringing the alliance closer to Russia's borders and extending collective defense guarantees to states that had long existed in a strategic gray zone. Over the years, Poland has treated NATO membership as more than merely symbolic. Successive governments have steadily increased the defense spending, modernized the armed forces, and hosted allied infrastructure. The country has also become one of NATO's most committed investors in defense, exceeding the alliance's 2% GDP benchmark on military spending well before many Western European partners. More recently, Warsaw has pushed spending even further, accelerating the procurement of advanced equipment and expanding the size of its armed forces. The same can't be said for all other transatlantic allies, however. After the Cold War, much of Europe dramatically reduced military budgets, confident that large-scale conflict on the continent had become unlikely. The United States continued to carry the overwhelming share of the alliance's defense burden, while many European members delayed modernization and allowed the equipment of their militaries to erode. The full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 shattered the image of safety cultivated during peacetime in Europe. The war forced NATO members to confront the reality that conventional conflict on the old continent had not disappeared. Defense budgets began to rise across the continent, but the pace and scale of increase has varied widely.
The golden age has just begun.
As the party inside the White House changed from blue to red with Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 US presidential election, Washington's patience for allies' lackluster defense investments waned. Trump demanded that European allies significantly increase defense spending, warning that the United States will no longer indefinitely subsidize Europe's security. For countries like Poland, which already invests heavily in defense, the message reinforces a long-standing argument. NATO's credibility ultimately depends on whether its members are willing to pay for their own security.
NATO, as we've seen, has blossomed into 32 members. Does this make it too big, too unwieldy to adopt a common policy?
Well, I think it's not the matter of this number of states, of the territory which allied countries cover. It's rather the matter of the differences when it comes to the perception of security situation of each country, especially the most influential one, like United States, of course, primus inter pares, and Germany, and also the differences in the way this public opinion in these countries and also strategic allies in these countries understand their interests. So to give an example of this, the first thing is, for example, Spain and this goal of NATO spending. Their assessment of the situation is different because they aren't right now under any direct pressure, any direct risk of military invasion.
Yes.
So from their perspective, it's not something urgent, it's not something needed. Of course, and Spain also is the member of Spain, they respect this fact, they try to give as much as they can. But if you discuss, for example, with people from Spain, like security experts, they have different view than we here on the eastern flank, and it's rather natural. The other thing, and I think much more important than this first example, is United States. What's the interest of United States right now, 2026? What are the goals? What are the priorities for them? And also, we all know that this main goal of United States, this main priority, is their rivalry with China.
Yes.
And it's different operational feature than Europe. It requires the scarce resources, it requires the scarce attention, strategic attention, and also it makes United States demand more effort on this European part of NATO. So these are the factors which, of course, should be taken into consideration when we think about the unity of NATO right now.
We seem to want guns and butter over the past 30 years, at least this peace dividend that you were talking about. that seems to be a very hot sticking point about how much does each member pay. Poland pays close to 5%, Spain 2% or something like that. Other countries pay even less. America, of course, pays the lion's share of this for this alliance, and we were talking before we came on air about the logistic infrastructure that it presents. When we heard that America wasn't all that keen on NATO, it was going to shift its attention to the Pacific, what sort of tremors of fear did it go through? Did it shake in NATO, or did it just make us say, okay, well, they don't really mean it? What would be the practical outcome of America actually shifting its resources from NATO in Europe to America in the Pacific? How would that leave us?
Yes, I think that's something we have to take seriously. United States changed the generations which are currently having impact on the decisions which are members of administration, members of the broader political movements, especially right now around President Trump. There are several factions, and some of these factions do not consider Europe as this part of the world which have this very special ties and relation with United States. That's something which they do not longer consider like the obvious thing, like the priority, like this way of perceiving the world which you base your decisions upon. Yes. So we should take this seriously, because one thing is this change of this generations of these thoughts. Another thing is what we already discussed, the priority of United States, the rivalry with China, which is the only state on the globe which have potential to oppose United States, to oppose the will of United States, and maybe in some future scenarios to confront militarily with United States. We've heard about many such analyses which were conducted by United States administration, war games which pointed toward the fact that the effect of clash around Taiwan is not so obvious. It could end in the loss of Navy of United States. So all of these facts should be interpreted as a risk which we couldn't ignore, and based on this assessment we should make moves which help us to prepare to hedge against this risk, like strengthening our own arms, like strengthening the formats of cooperation with the states which have a similar assessment of the security situation as us, as Poland, from our perspective, talking from our perspective, like Scandinavian countries, for example. 2 new members, by the way, isn't it? Sweden and Finland. Yes, and it's something that Russia triggered by this invasion, of course. So that's also not to be, because when you ask this question, of course, there is this problem of potential aggression of Russia against NATO against our region. And of course, it wouldn't be wise to ignore such risks. But also, we are talking more than 4 years after the start of this war, and while Russia is still fighting, they have many resources, they also lost many, and they lost a lot of this potential that could be potentially used against us. So while we should be cautious and we shouldn't ignore these risks, it's not a terrible situation right now. Yes, we can't retreat back into complacency. The Iranian American-Israeli-Iranian conflict at the moment, does that have the potential of drawing in NATO as an alliance, or just individual countries of NATO? For example, NATO went in as an alliance into places like Afghanistan, Iraq, on the basis of Article 5 of the treaty. Is there a potential for NATO being dragged in or drawn in, however you look at it, into this war as NATO? Or is it going to be, again, one of these out-of-area expeditions that we saw in the early part of this century? Well, so we have to start with the observation that decision about the involvement of any of allied countries is a political decision made in the capital of this country by its government. So there is no this automatism in this decision. They will decide, and of course they could decide if they will be asked by United States to involve in the broader way or any way, because right now most of these countries are not involved, or at least they are not involved through NATO structures. But if the United States, if Donald Trump requires something like that, potentially, theoretically, this decision to say yes is of course on the table. The governments could do it. Is it the possible situation, or how would I assess the possibility of this situation is another question. And as for now, we have no signs that United States will ask for something like that. They rather use it to criticize the Western countries, and they also, for example, when it comes to this exchange with United Kingdom, criticize the United Kingdom for not being involved from the very beginning. But also, in my opinion, it's something that wouldn't be right now so eagerly used by United States, by President Trump, because it works both ways. If you use this structure and show that this structure, this alliance could be right now used to mobilize stronger support, it works both ways. So yes. In my opinion, United States right now under President Trump, they try to lower the significance of NATO, maybe not to get out right now, maybe not to dismantle the alliance, but they try to get more movement, more freedom of maneuver. Yes, I think it's about that. So using it right now will tighten this maneuver.
I'd love to talk with you about the tension between the EU army and the NATO alliance, but we'll leave that for another time. But for the time being, Krzysztof Jaworski, thanks very much for coming onto our programme.
Thank you very much.
So that's it. That's all we have time for today. Join us next time, Tuesdays 21:35, 35 minutes past 9. See you then.